Christmas is coming, and I will be alone this year. So please leave a Christmas greeting that will warm my heart in the comments. Okay, let's go. The hunt for Christmas. Christmas in Iceland. It sounded like the perfect escape from the monotony of the holidays back home. For me, Eric and Tyler, it wasn't about tradition. It was about adventure. Snowboarding in the mountains, checking out glaciers, and maybe meeting some locals to party with. We booked a secluded cabin near Husafell, in the shadow of icy mountains and endless snowfields. The place was perfect, rustic but cozy, with a big wood stove and enough beer in the fridge to last us through a blizzard. For the first 2 days, everything went as planned. We hiked, took ridiculous selfies in front of frozen waterfalls, and even got a little tipsy trying Icelandic schnapps. The villagers we met were friendly, if not a bit reserved. A couple of them gave us odd looks when we mentioned where we were staying. "Be careful," one older woman said in broken English, her pale eyes sharp. "Not good to be alone. Not at Christmas." We laughed it off, assuming it was some cultural thing we didn't understand. The knock came on the third night. It was already late, and the wind outside howled like a chorus of wolves. We'd just finished a round of cards when the loud, urgent banging at the door startled us all. Tyler got up first, peeking through the frosted window. "It's some guy," he said, opening the door cautiously. Standing there was a man, probably in his late 40s, with a weathered face and frantic eyes. Snow clung to his dark coat and knit cap. He was breathing hard, his voice shaking as he spoke. "Help," he said in heavily accented English. "Please, my son." We let him in, pulling chairs closer to the wood stove. His name was Sigurdur, though he told us to call him Siggy. His words came fast, his hands trembling as he tried to explain. His son, Jonas, had gone missing earlier that evening. They lived on a small farm not far from our cabin, and Siggy had been searching for hours in the freezing cold. Eric leaned forward. "Have you called the police?" Siggy shook his head violently. No police. They cannot help with this." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Siggy's eyes darted to the window, as if expecting to see something lurking outside. "She took him," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She? Who's a she?" Tyler asked, his brow furrowed. "Gryla." The name hung in the air like a curse. Siggy told us about her, about the monstrous Icelandic witch who comes down from the mountains at Christmas, stealing naughty children and stuffing them into her sack to cook and eat. "Are you serious?" Tyler asked, looking half amused. "You want us to help you hunt down some fairy tale witch?" But Siggy wasn't laughing. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. "This is not story," he said, his voice breaking. "She is real, and she has my son." I don't know why we agreed to help him. Maybe it was the desperation in his voice, or the raw terror in his eyes. Or maybe it was just the beer making us feel braver than we actually were. We layered up, grabbed flashlights, and followed Siggy into the freezing night. Snow crunched beneath our boots, and our breath came in visible puffs as we trudged toward his farm. The farmhouse was small, with a single light glowing faintly from inside. Siggy pointed to the edge of the property, where a dense forest loomed. "She went that way," he said. "How do you know?" Eric asked skeptically. Siggy led us to the snow near the barn. There, illuminated by our flashlights, were massive footprints, long and clawed, spaced so far apart that whatever had made them must have been enormous. "Holy crap," Tyler muttered, his bravado evaporating. We entered the forest, the trees closing in around us like skeletal hands. The only sounds were the crunch of snow and the distant wail of the wind. After about an hour of searching, we found something. Not Jonas, but a small woolen mitten half buried in the snow. Siggy picked it up, his face crumpling with emotion. "She is close," he said. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The first sign of her came when the wind shifted. It carried a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. We froze, our flashlights darting through the trees. "Did you hear that?" Tyler whispered, his voice shaking. Another growl answered him, followed by a sound like branches snapping, or bones breaking. "Run!" Siggy said suddenly. "What?" Eric asked, but Siggy was already moving, his flashlight bouncing as he sprinted through the snow. We didn't wait to find out what he'd seen. We ran after him, the growls growing louder and closer. We burst into a small clearing and stopped dead. There, in the middle of the snow, was a figure. She was impossibly tall, her hunched back making her look even more grotesque. Her hair was wild and tangled, her skin pale and cracked like old porcelain. She held a massive sack over one shoulder, the fabric writhing as if something inside was struggling to get out. "Jonas!" Siggy screamed, stepping forward. Gryla turned her head slowly, her eyes burning like hot coals. She opened her mouth, revealing jagged yellow teeth, and let out a sound that was somewhere between a roar and a laugh. She dropped the sack, reaching out with long clawed fingers. Siggy raised a shotgun I hadn't even realized he'd been carrying and fired. The sound was deafening, but it didn't stop her. What happened next was a blur. Gryla lunged, her claws swiping through the air inches from my face. We scattered, stumbling through the snow as she pursued us. At some point, Siggy managed to grab the sack and pull it open. Inside was Jonas, pale and terrified but alive. Siggy shoved him behind him, standing between his son and the witch. Eric and Tyler grabbed branches, waving them like makeshift weapons. It was stupid and desperate, but it worked. Gryla hesitated, her burning eyes flicking between us. "Go!" Siggy yelled, grabbing Jonas and pulling him toward the trees. We followed, adrenaline propelling us forward. We didn't stop running until we reached the farmhouse. Siggy barricaded the door, his hands shaking. Jonas clung to him, sobbing. "She will come back," Siggy said, his voice hollow. But she didn't. Whether it was the gunshot, the fight, or something else entirely, Gryla left us alone that night. The next morning, we packed our bags and left without looking back. I don't know if I believe in witches or monsters, but I believe in what I saw, and I'll never set foot in Iceland again. The Terror of Grýla. When my wife Ava suggested we spend Christmas in Iceland, I thought it was the perfect way to escape the chaos of the city. We'd always dreamed of experiencing the country's remote beauty, endless snowfields, frozen waterfalls, and those magical northern lights. So we rented a secluded cabin in the woods just outside of Akureyri. It was rustic and charming, with a wood-burning stove, thick stone walls, and a view of the distant mountains that made you feel like the last people on Earth. It was supposed to be a peaceful holiday. Just Ava, our 8-year-old son, Max, and me. But instead, it turned into the kind of nightmare you don't wake up from. Our first few days were everything we'd hoped for. We hiked through the snowy forest, built snowmen, and warmed up with mugs of hot chocolate by the fire. The locals were friendly, although they often seemed hesitant when we mentioned the cabin. One shopkeeper even gave us a handful of candles, for protection, without explaining further. On the third day, we decided to explore Akureyri's Christmas market. Max was thrilled by the colourful decorations and traditional treats, and Ava and I marvelled at the quaint stalls selling handmade goods. But one booth stopped us cold. A stall covered in grotesque drawings of a hideous old woman with sharp claws, jagged teeth, and hollow, glaring eyes. "That's Gryla," the vendor explained in a thick accent, noticing our horrified expressions. "She's the Yule Witch. She comes down from the mountains at Christmas to punish naughty children, and sometimes their families." Max giggled nervously, tugging at my sleeve. "It's just a story, right, Dad?" "Of course," I reassured him, but the vendor didn't smile. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Keep your boy close. Gryla is always watching during Christmas." By the time we got back to the cabin that evening, the sun had already set. The wind howled around us as we carried our bags inside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Ava must have noticed my unease because she smiled and squeezed my hand. "It's just the isolation getting to you," she said. "Let's light the fire and relax." But that night, the first sign of trouble appeared. I woke up to the sound of something scratching against the cabin walls. It was faint at first, almost like tree branches brushing the wood. But as I lay there, holding my breath, it grew louder and more deliberate, like claws scraping. I nudged Ava awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She listened for a moment, then shook her head. Probably just the wind. But I wasn't convinced. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and peered out the window. The beam of light revealed nothing but swirling snow and dark trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't belong. The next morning, I found strange tracks in the snow outside the cabin. They were too large to be human, but not quite animal either. The prints were uneven, as if made by something walking on two legs. When I showed them to Ava, she frowned. "Maybe it's just a reindeer or something," she said, but her voice wavered. Max, ever the curious child, wanted to follow the tracks, but I stopped him. "No," I said firmly. "We stay close to the cabin." That night, the scratching returned, louder than before. This time, it wasn't just on the walls. It was on the windows too. The sound sent chills down my spine, and I could see Ava was scared now too. We huddled together in the living room, the fire crackling weakly as the storm outside raged on. Then came the knocking. 3 loud, deliberate knocks on the front door. Max screamed, and Ava clutched him tightly. I grabbed a fire poker, my heart racing as I approached the door. "Who's there?" I called out, but there was no answer. Just silence. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. Summoning what little courage I had, I opened the door a crack and froze. Standing in the snow was a figure unlike anything I'd ever seen. She was massive, her hunched form covered in filthy rags and animal skins. Her face was a nightmare come to life, hollow eyes that glowed faintly, a crooked nose, and a mouth filled with sharp, uneven teeth. Her long, claw-like fingers clutched a burlap sack that writhed as though something inside was alive. "Gryla," I whispered, my voice trembling. Her lips twisted into a grotesque grin, and she reached out, her claws grazing the door. "You've been bad," she hissed, her voice like ice cracking. "And so has the boy." I slammed the door shut and bolted it. "Ava, take Max upstairs, now!" The rest of the night was a blur of terror. Gryla didn't leave. She circled the cabin, her clawed hands scraping at the walls, and her guttural growls echoing through the storm. At one point, I thought I saw her peering through the living room window, her glowing eyes burning into mine. We barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, lighting the candles the shopkeeper had given us and praying they would offer some kind of protection. Max clung to Ava, sobbing, while I stood by the door, clutching the fire poker like it was the only thing keeping us alive. The scratching and growling continued until dawn, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. When we emerged from the bedroom, the cabin was in shambles. The front door was torn off its hinges, deep gouges marked the walls, and the snow outside was littered with massive, uneven footprints. But worst of all was the note pinned to the wall with a bone knife. It was written in a language I couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. I'll be back. We packed up and left that morning, abandoning our dream Christmas and the nightmare that had come with it. We didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe us? But even now, back in the safety of our home, I can't escape the memory of her face. And every Christmas, when the wind howls outside and the snow begins to fall, I wonder if Gryla is out there, waiting for her chance to strike again. Gryla's frost. When my husband, Leif, suggested we spend Christmas in a remote cabin in Iceland, I wasn't sure what to expect. Leif had grown up in Norway and had a love for the outdoors, but I was more accustomed to the comforts of city life. Our children, Ingrid and Emil, were thrilled by the idea of snowy landscapes and the chance to see the northern lights. I didn't want to dampen their excitement, so I agreed. We rented a rustic cabin near a small village called Vik. The scenery was breathtaking: jagged cliffs, frozen waterfalls, and endless fields of snow. But there was something unsettling about the area, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The villagers were polite but distant, and I often caught them casting wary glances at us when we mentioned our plans to spend Christmas in the cabin. The cabin itself was charming in its own way, though far more isolated than I'd expected. It sat on the edge of a dark forest, with a narrow dirt road leading back to the village. The air was bitterly cold, and the silence was absolute. No cars, no birds, not even the sound of the wind. On our second evening, Leif lit a fire while Ingrid and Emil played with their new wooden toys from the village market. I was in the kitchen, preparing hot chocolate, when I noticed something strange. The windows were frosted over from the inside. I wiped one with my sleeve to peer out, and my heart skipped a beat. Standing at the edge of the forest was a figure, a hunched silhouette, shrouded in mist. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the cabin. "Leif!" I called out, my voice trembling. He rushed in, concern etched on his face. "What's wrong?" I pointed to the window, but the figure was gone. There was someone, or something, watching us. Leif frowned and peered out. "It's probably a villager out for a walk. Don't worry, Astrid." But I wasn't convinced. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like claws raking against wood. I thought I was dreaming until I heard Emil scream from the next room. Leif and I bolted out of bed and ran to the children's room. Ingrid was sitting up in her bed, wide-eyed and clutching her blanket, while Emil was crying hysterically. "She was here," Emil sobbed. "The old woman!" "What old woman?" Leif asked, kneeling by his bed. "She was looking at me through the window," Emil whispered, his voice trembling. "Her face was wrong." Leif tried to reassure him, but when I glanced at the window, I saw deep scratches etched into the frosted glass. The next morning, Leif dismissed the incident as a nightmare, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. The scratches on the window were real, and Emil wasn't the kind of child to make up stories. While Leif took the kids sledding, I decided to visit the village to ask about the area's history. I found an elderly woman named Sigrun, who seemed more open than the others. When I mentioned our cabin, her face paled. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said, her voice low. "Why? What's wrong with it?" She hesitated, then leaned closer. "That forest, it's where Gryla hunts." "Gryla?" Sigrun nodded. "She's an ancient witch, a monster. She comes down from the mountains during Christmas to punish the wicked. She has no mercy, especially for children." When I returned to the cabin, I told Leif what Sigrun had said. He laughed it off, calling it an old folk tale meant to scare kids into behaving. But that night, we discovered it wasn't just a story. We were sitting by the fire when the lights flickered. A moment later, they went out entirely, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Stay here," Leif said, grabbing a flashlight. As he moved toward the breaker box, the scratching returned, this time louder, more insistent. It came from all around us. The windows, the walls, even the roof. "Leif!" I screamed. He shone his flashlight toward the window and we saw her. Gryla. Her face was pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Her skin was ashen and stretched tight over her skull, and her mouth was filled with jagged yellowed teeth. She grinned, her breath fogging the glass as her clawed hands scratched deep grooves into it. Leif froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Then Gryla disappeared. The rest of the night was a blur of chaos. The cabin seemed alive, groaning and creaking as if under immense pressure. The fire went out, leaving us shivering in the cold. The scratching continued, punctuated by guttural growls that echoed through the darkness. Leif and I barricaded the children in their room and piled furniture against the doors and windows. I clutched a kitchen knife, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was out there. At one point, I heard Ingrid whisper, "Mama! She's calling me!" My blood ran cold. "Who's calling you?" "The woman," Ingrid said, pointing to the window. "She wants me to come outside." I grabbed her and held her close, whispering prayers under my breath. By dawn, the noises stopped. We emerged from the barricaded room to find the cabin in shambles. The front door was hanging off its hinges, and the windows were shattered. Deep claw marks covered the walls and floors, and strange symbols were etched into the wood, symbols that glowed faintly in the morning light. Leif and I didn't speak. We packed our things in silence, loaded the children into the car, and drove away. As we passed the edge of the forest, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw her, Gryla, standing among the trees, watching us with that twisted grin. We never spoke of that Christmas again. But even now, years later, I can't look at frost on a window without feeling a chill run down my spine. Because I know she's still out there, waiting for her next chance to strike. A cold welcome. It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. My best friend Jordan and I had always been fascinated by the allure of Iceland, its glaciers, volcanoes, and most of all, its isolation. When Jordan suggested we spend Christmas there, I jumped at the chance. We'd both grown tired of the same family dinners and endless carols back home in Michigan. We booked a tiny cabin in a remote village outside Akureyri. The online listing described it as cozy, with breathtaking views of the mountains. By the time we arrived, the breathtaking views were hidden behind a relentless snowfall, and the cozy cabin felt more like an icebox with walls. The villagers were welcoming but noticeably cautious when they learned where we were staying. A man at the cafe with weathered skin and a thick accent asked, "Why that cabin?" "It was cheap and we're broke college students," Jordan replied with a laugh. The man didn't smile. "Stay inside at night," he said, his voice low. Jordan raised an eyebrow, waiting for an explanation that never came. The man simply turned back to his coffee, muttering something in Icelandic that I couldn't catch. The cabin itself was small but functional. A kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and 2 single beds crammed into a room that smelled faintly of damp wood. Outside, the wind howled and snow blanketed everything. By the time night fell, the isolation began to set in. We passed the time with board games and cheap beer, laughing at our decision to skip Christmas with our families. "Here's to adventure," Jordan toasted, raising his can. The wind seemed to answer him, rattling the windows like an angry spirit. The first strange thing happened on our second night. We'd spent the day exploring nearby trails and returned exhausted, the cold biting through our layers. After dinner, we sprawled out on the small couch to watch a movie on Jordan's tablet. Around midnight, a loud thump came from outside. "Probably snow falling off the roof," Jordan said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. I wasn't so sure. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. The snow outside was pristine, untouched, but something about the darkness felt alive, like it was watching us. When I turned back, Jordan was already at the door, pulling on his boots. "Let's check it out," he said. "Are you crazy? It's freezing," I protested. But Jordan was already outside, his flashlight cutting through the snow. Reluctantly, I followed. We circled the cabin, finding nothing but endless white. Just as I was about to head back inside, Jordan stopped, his light fixed on the ground. "Look," he said, pointing. In the snow were massive footprints. They were long and clawed, spaced far apart as if whatever made them had been running. "What the hell is that?" I asked, my breath visible in the frigid air. Jordan shook his head. "A bear? Do they even have bears here?" We hurried back inside, locking the door behind us. The next night, the knocking started. We'd just finished dinner and were playing cards when a sharp, deliberate bang echoed through the cabin. It came from the front door. "Who would be out here in this weather?" I asked, my stomach twisting. Jordan grabbed the flashlight, motioning for me to stay back. He opened the door just a crack, shining the light outside. Nothing. No one. But there, in the snow, were more of those clawed footprints, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the forest. By the fourth night, the atmosphere in the cabin was suffocating. The wind seemed to carry whispers, faint but undeniable. At one point, I thought I heard my name. That evening, as we sat in tense silence, the knocking returned, this time at the back door. It was followed by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. "We're leaving," Jordan announced, grabbing his coat. "Where are we supposed to go?" I asked. "We'll freeze out there." "I'd rather take my chances with the cold," he said, his voice shaking. But before we could step outside, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed on the roof. Something was up there, moving slowly but deliberately. Then, the scratching began. Long, deliberate scrapes against the roof tiles, as if claws were raking across them. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. Jordan didn't answer. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The real horror came on Christmas Eve. We were huddled by the fireplace, too scared to sleep, when the power cut out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the flickering fire, casting eerie shadows on the walls. That's when we heard it. a voice low and gravelly speaking in Icelandic. It came from outside, circling the cabin. I couldn't understand the words, but the malice in them was clear. Then, the door burst open. Standing in the doorway was a figure I will never forget. She was impossibly tall, her head nearly brushing the frame. Her face was grotesque, with sagging skin and sharp, jagged teeth that glinted in the firelight. Her eyes burned like embers, and her hair hung in matted clumps. In one massive hand, she held a sack that squirmed and wriggled, as if something or someone was inside. "Gryla," Jordan whispered, his voice barely audible. I had no idea who or what that was, but the fear in his voice told me everything I needed to know. The creature stepped forward, her clawed feet leaving deep gouges in the wooden floor. We scrambled to the back door, flinging it open and plunging into the snow. The cold bit into my skin, but adrenaline kept me moving. We ran blindly through the forest, the sound of her growls and heavy footsteps close behind. At one point, I tripped, falling face first into the snow. Jordan hauled me up, and we kept running, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Finally, we saw lights in the distance. The village. The moment we stumbled into the square, the villagers surrounded us, their faces grim. One of them, a man in his 50s, nodded knowingly. "You saw her," he said. It wasn't a question. We told them everything. The villagers exchanged glances before one of them handed us a cup of something warm and strong. "Gryla," the man explained. "She hunts during Christmas, punishing those she deems unworthy. You are lucky to escape." We left Iceland the next morning, our flight booked hastily and without any sleep. Even now, back in Michigan, I can't shake the memory of her face, or the sound of her voice circling the cabin. Christmas will never feel the same again. The winter's grasp. Christmas in Iceland had always been on my bucket list, a dream wrapped in snow-capped mountains, glittering lights, and otherworldly beauty. My girlfriend Brooke and I decided to make it a reality that year. It felt like the perfect escape from our hectic lives back in Chicago. We rented a cozy cabin near the edge of a small village called Skólholt. It was isolated, surrounded by rolling hills of snow and twisted trees that looked like skeletons in the moonlight. The locals were friendly enough, but seemed wary when they learned where we were staying. "Don't wander too far at night," an older woman at the bakery warned us on our first day. Her wrinkled hands shook slightly as she wrapped our pastries. "And keep your fire burning." Brooke laughed it off. "Are wolves a problem?" The woman didn't smile. "It's not wolves you need to worry about." Her words stuck with me, though I didn't share my unease with Brooke. The first few days were magical. We hiked frozen trails, bathed in steaming hot springs, and even caught a glimpse of the northern lights. But by Christmas Eve, a storm rolled in, trapping us in the cabin. "It's kind of romantic, don't you think?" Brooke said, pouring us both hot cocoa as the wind howled outside. I nodded, though the flickering firelight cast strange shadows across the room, making me feel anything but cozy. Later that evening, as we played cards by the fire, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Brooke and I froze, exchanging puzzled glances. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight and approached the door. "Who is it?" No answer. I hesitated before opening it, half expecting to see a stranded traveller. But there was no one there, just the swirling snow and darkness beyond. Brooke joined me, peering out nervously. Maybe it was the wind? I wanted to believe her, but something about the stillness outside felt wrong. We bolted the door and tried to shake off the unease, but the mood had shifted. Around midnight, we were startled awake by a loud crash from the kitchen. "What was that?" Brooke gasped, clutching my arm. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously made my way to the kitchen. The table was overturned, chairs scattered like something had swept through the room in a rage. "An animal," Brooke whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head. The doors and windows are locked. Nothing could have gotten in. Before we could process it, a deep, guttural growl echoed from outside, followed by the crunch of heavy footsteps in the snow. Brooke grabbed my arm. "We need to call someone." I tried the phone, but the storm had knocked out the signal. The growling grew louder, circling the cabin. Shadows moved outside, too large and too fast to be human. Suddenly, there was another knock at the door. This one frantic, desperate. "Please," a voice shouted in broken English. "Let me in." I opened the door to find a man standing there, his face pale and streaked with blood. He looked to be in his 40s, with a thick beard and wild eyes. "She's coming," he gasped, collapsing into the cabin. "Who's coming?" I asked, helping him to a chair. "Gryla," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She's taken my son." The man's name was Björn, and he lived in a nearby village. His son, Einar, had gone missing earlier that evening. Björn had followed the tracks through the snow, leading him toward the forest near our cabin. "She hunts the wicked," Björn explained, his hands shaking as he drank the tea Brooke handed him. "But sometimes she takes the innocent too." "Who is she?" Brooke asked, her voice barely audible. Björn looked at us, his eyes haunted. "Gryla, the Christmas witch." Before we could ask more, the growling returned, louder and closer this time. The cabin walls seemed to vibrate with the sound. Björn jumped to his feet. "We must find Einar before it's too late." Brooke and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we couldn't just let him go out there alone. Armed with flashlights and a kitchen knife, we followed him into the storm. The wind cut through us like knives as we trudged through the snow, the beams of our flashlights barely piercing the darkness. Björn led the way, his footsteps hurried and desperate. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge of the forest. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. "Over here," Björn whispered, pointing to a cluster of trees. In the snow, we found claw marks and drops of blood leading deeper into the woods. As we followed the trail, the air grew colder, and an oppressive feeling settled over us. Brooke clung to my arm, her breath visible in the freezing air. Suddenly, a scream tore through the night, a child's scream. "Einar!" Björn shouted, breaking into a run. We chased after him, our flashlights bouncing wildly. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches like grasping hands. Finally, we burst into a small clearing. In the center stood a grotesque figure, Gryla. She was massive, her hunched form covered in tattered furs. Her face was a nightmare, wrinkled and twisted, with sharp, yellowed teeth and eyes that glowed like embers. In her clawed hands, she held a struggling boy. "Einar!" Björn cried, rushing forward. Gryla let out a deafening roar, throwing the boy to the ground. She turned her fiery gaze on us, her mouth twisting into a snarl. I froze, paralyzed by fear, but Björn didn't hesitate. He lunged at Gryla with a hunting knife, slashing at her legs. She howled in pain, swiping at him with her claws. "Run!" Björn shouted at us. Brooke and I grabbed Einar, pulling him to his feet. The boy was pale and shivering, but otherwise unharmed. "We can't leave him!" Brooke screamed as Björn continued to fight the witch. Gryla swung her arm, sending Björn crashing into a tree. He slumped to the ground, unmoving. The witch turned her attention to us, her glowing eyes narrowing. Just as she lunged, the bells started ringing. From the village below, the sound of church bells echoed through the forest. Gryla froze, her head snapping toward the sound. "No!" she growled, backing away. The bells grew louder, drowning out the storm. Gryla let out a furious roar before retreating into the shadows, disappearing into the woods. We carried Björn back to the cabin, where he regained consciousness hours later. He was battered but alive, and Einar clung to him, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," Björn said, his voice thick with emotion. We spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, too scared to sleep. By morning, the storm had cleared, and villagers arrived to take Björn and Einar home. Brooke and I cut our trip short, leaving Iceland the next day. I'll never forget the beauty of the country, or the horror that lurks in its darkest corners. Frost and shadows. When my wife, Rebecca, suggested we spend Christmas in Iceland, I thought it was an odd choice. I'd always imagined Christmas as a cozy holiday at home in New Jersey, but she was captivated by the idea of Iceland's otherworldly landscapes and the chance to see the northern lights. Our daughters, Madison and Olivia, were excited too. After weeks of Rebecca gushing over brochures and itineraries, I caved and booked a remote cabin near a village called Höfen. The journey was long but beautiful. Snow-capped mountains and stretches of ice-covered ground passed by as we drove. The cabin was nestled on the edge of a valley, surrounded by dense, blackened trees. It was picturesque in a way that felt almost surreal. Too perfect, too quiet. The locals were friendly but noticeably reserved when they learned we'd be staying in that particular cabin. One older man at the market warned us, "The winters here are not always kind." Rebecca smiled and thanked him, chalking it up to small-town superstitions. I could tell she wasn't concerned, but his words lingered in the back of my mind as we drove to our cabin. We arrived on Christmas Eve, and the girls were giddy with excitement. Madison, who was 12, was already planning snowball fights, while Olivia, 8, couldn't wait to try sledding. Rebecca set about decorating the cabin with lights and a small artificial tree we'd brought from home. The cabin itself was cozy but old, with creaky wooden floors and windows that let in the chill no matter how high we turned up the heat. By the time night fell, snow had begun to drift steadily outside, blanketing the world in white. Our first night, something strange happened. I was sitting in the living room with Rebecca, watching a movie while the girls played in their room. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the cabin as if something heavy had fallen. Rebecca and I exchanged looks before hurrying into the kitchen. On the floor, a cast-iron pan that had been hanging securely on the wall lay at our feet. "That's odd," I said, picking it up. The hook was still intact, and the pan showed no signs of slipping off on its own. "Maybe one of us hung it wrong," Rebecca offered, but she didn't sound convinced. We put it back, shrugged it off, and went to bed. The next few days were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. On Christmas night, it escalated. We'd just put the girls to bed and were sitting by the fire when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the roof. It was slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to a bird or squirrel. Rebecca stiffened, clutching my arm. "Do you think it's Santa?" she joked weakly. trying to calm her own nerves. "I'll go check," I said, grabbing a flashlight. I stepped outside into the icy wind, my breath clouding in front of me. The snow on the roof was undisturbed, and the forest was silent. Too silent. "See anything?" Rebecca called from the door. I shook my head and went back inside, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. The real terror began on the third night. I woke to Madison shaking me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Dad, someone's outside," she whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked, sitting up. I saw a face, in the window. Grabbing a flashlight and the small hatchet we'd brought for splitting wood, I hurried to the living room window. The snow outside reflected the faint glow of moonlight, but there were no footprints. "It must have been a shadow," I told her, trying to reassure her. But then the knocking started. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks echoed through the cabin, coming from the back door. Rebecca appeared in the hallway, clutching Olivia. "Who's out there?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, moving toward the door. "Don't open it," she pleaded. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door to find nothing but a black expanse of forest. Snow was falling lightly, but there were no footprints leading to or from the cabin. That night, none of us slept. The girls stayed huddled in our bed while Rebecca and I sat in the living room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The knocking returned, louder and more frantic, moving from door to window to wall. At one point, Olivia screamed, pointing at the window near the fireplace. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. It was grotesque, with pale, sagging skin and empty eye sockets. Its mouth twisted into a cruel grin, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. The moment I shone the flashlight on it, it vanished. Rebecca burst into tears. "We have to leave," she said. I couldn't argue. As dawn approached, the noises stopped. We packed our things as quickly as we could and loaded the car. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. "Of course," I muttered under my breath. With no other choice, we trudged through the snow back toward the village, the girls clutching our hands tightly. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees casting long, ominous shadows. Halfway to the village, Madison froze. "What's wrong?" Rebecca asked. She pointed ahead, her hand trembling. Standing in the middle of the path was a tall, hunched figure. It wore tattered, fur-lined robes, and its face was hidden beneath a hood. In its clawed hand, it held a sack that squirmed as if something inside was alive. The figure tilted its head, as though studying us. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the trees. When we finally reached the village, the locals immediately knew what had happened. An elderly woman named Ida pulled us into her home and handed us warm blankets and mugs of tea. "You've seen Gryla," she said gravely. Rebecca and I exchanged confused glances. "Gryla? She's a witch," Ida explained. "She hunts during Christmas, searching for misbehaving children. If she knocks, it's a warning. If she comes inside..." She trailed off, her meaning clear. We left Iceland the next day, cutting our trip short. Rebecca didn't protest, and neither did the girls. Even now, back in New Jersey, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, expecting to hear knocking on the walls or see that twisted face in the window. Christmas will never feel safe again. The frozen terror. Visiting Iceland for Christmas was my idea, a chance to escape the commercial chaos back home. For years, I dreamed of experiencing the raw beauty of the land of fire and ice, with its endless snowy landscapes and cozy traditions. My 2 best friends, Jonah and Chris, were less sold on the idea, but came along for the adventure. We rented a cabin outside of Akureyri, surrounded by nothing but snow and silence. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. A peaceful retreat where we could unwind, drink hot cocoa, and maybe catch the northern lights. The first few days were magical. We explored frozen waterfalls, hiked through snowy trails, and stuffed ourselves with Icelandic treats we couldn't pronounce. Locals were friendly but often reserved, as if they carried some secret they weren't eager to share. The strange look started when we mentioned the cabin. A barista at a cafe frowned when I described where we were staying. "You're far out there," she said. "You'll hear the winds, and maybe more." I laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking or not. By Christmas Eve, the temperature had dropped dramatically. The wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, and the snow piled so high we could barely see out the windows. That evening, after a big dinner and several rounds of drinks, we settled into the living room. The fireplace crackled warmly, and Chris joked about how this was the quietest Christmas he'd ever had. Jonah yawned. "Quiet is good. I'm sick of big family gatherings where everyone argues about politics." I raised my glass. "To peaceful Christmases." The crash from outside shattered the moment. We froze, staring at one another as the sound echoed through the stillness. It wasn't the wind. This was louder, heavier, like something large had fallen. Chris grabbed a flashlight. Probably just snow sliding off the roof. Jonah and I followed him outside, shivering in the icy wind. The snow reflected the moonlight, making the landscape eerily bright. We circled the cabin, our breath fogging the air. There was nothing near the walls, no sign of what had caused the noise. But as we turned back toward the front door, we saw them. Footprints. They were massive, far too large to belong to a person, and they led from the edge of the forest right up to the cabin. "What the hell?" Jonah whispered. Chris crouched down, his flashlight tracing the prints. They were deep, with claw-like impressions at the toes. "We should go back inside," I said, my voice shaking. We bolted the door and turned every lock in the cabin. Chris insisted it was a prank, that some local was messing with the tourists, but Jonah wasn't convinced. "Did you see the size of those prints?" he said. "No one's walking around barefoot in this weather." I didn't say anything, but my stomach was in knots. Something about those tracks felt wrong. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though none of us slept well. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind made me jump. Christmas morning dawned grey and bitterly cold. The storm had worsened overnight, burying the tracks under fresh snow. Jonah was the first to notice something was off. "Guys," he called from the kitchen, "where's the food?" "What do you mean?" I asked, walking in to see him staring into the empty fridge. "Everything's gone," he said. "The leftovers, the beer, even the milk." Chris frowned. "You're kidding, right?" But when we searched the rest of the cabin, we realized it wasn't just the food. My jacket was missing. So were Chris's boots and Jonah's backpack. "Who the hell would steal all that?" Chris said, his voice rising. "We didn't hear anything last night." Jonah looked toward the window. Maybe whatever left those tracks came back. That evening, we tried to shake off the unease by playing cards and drinking what little liquor we had left. The wind howled louder than ever, rattling the windows and making the cabin feel smaller by the minute. Around midnight, there was another crash, this time from inside the cabin. We all froze, staring at one another. "What was that?" Chris whispered. It came again, louder. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Basement," Jonah said, his face pale. I grabbed a fireplace poker and Chris armed himself with a kitchen knife. Slowly, we made our way to the basement door. The handle was cold under my hand, and my heart pounded as I turned it. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended into the darkness. Chris's flashlight swept across the room, revealing shelves lined with canned goods and old tools. Then the light landed on the corner. A figure stood there, hunched and massive, its back turned to us. Its long matted hair hung like curtains, and its shoulders rose and fell with each ragged breath. "Holy," Chris began, but the thing turned before he could finish. Its face was grotesque, with sunken eyes, a twisted nose, and jagged teeth that gleamed in the light. It let out a low growl, its clawed hands reaching toward us. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Chris back toward the stairs. We slammed the basement door shut and barricaded it with furniture. The thing roared from below, the sound vibrating through the walls. "What the hell is that?" Jonah shouted, his voice cracking. Chris was shaking, clutching the knife like it was the only thing keeping him alive. "It's her," I said, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. "Gryla!" Jonah stared at me, his eyes wide. "You're joking, right? That's just a stupid legend." "Does that thing look like a legend to you?" Chris snapped. For hours, we listened to her pounding on the door, her claws scraping against the wood. "She's not going to stop," Jonah said finally, his voice hollow. Chris nodded, his jaw tight. "We have to get out of here." "But how?" I asked. "She's right below us." Jonah looked out the window. "The storm's letting up. If we make a run for it, maybe we can reach the village." We packed quickly, grabbing whatever we could carry. The wind had died down, but the cold was brutal as we stepped outside. The snow crunched under our boots, and every shadow felt like it was watching us. We hadn't made it far when the growling started again. It was behind us, closer than I'd expected. "Don't look back," Chris said, his voice tight. But I couldn't help it. I turned my head and saw her. Gryla was massive, her twisted body moving with terrifying speed as she charged through the snow. "Run!" I shouted, adrenaline kicking in. We reached the village just as she closed the distance. Lights flickered on as we screamed for help, and doors opened to reveal startled faces. "Gryla!" Jonah yelled, pointing behind us. The villagers didn't hesitate. They grabbed torches and weapons, forming a line between us and the monster. Gryla stopped, her red eyes glowing as she let out a deafening roar. For a moment, I thought she might attack, but then she turned, retreating into the darkness. The villagers escorted us to a warm house, where we sat trembling by the fire. "Why didn't you warn us?" I asked one of the men. He shrugged. "Would you have believed us?" I didn't answer. I don't know what Gryla is or why she does what she does, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never spend Christmas in Iceland again. Thank you for listening. Bloody subscribe. And I wish you a scary Christmas. Good night.